Hi, and welcome to Wheaton College's Core Book Podcast. Wheaton College is an interdenominational Christian college where we pursue faith and liberal arts learning with passion. Core Book is Wheaton's community reading program associated with our Christ at the Core curriculum. Each year we select a book and invite students, faculty, staff, alumni, parents, neighbors near and far, all communities associated with the college to join in. Believing that we read better in community, we create materials to support readers and plan scholarly and creative events to bring readers together. You can find out more at www.wheaton.edu/corebook. As for this Core Book podcast, this is our first season, a 10-episode read-through of the 2024-2025 core book, Homer's Odyssey, with Professor of Classical Languages Alex Loney and Professor of English Ben Weber. Our purpose is to provide accompaniment, community, and nerdy joy to readers near and far. I'm your host, Tiffany Eberly-Kreiner. Let's read. Welcome. I'm Dr. Tiffany Kreiner, and my co-host is Dr. Ben Weber. Dr. Weber, can you tell me a little bit more about what you do here at the college?
Sure. Well, to sort of piggyback on your intro, I am in fact a specialist in nerd love. I teach in the English department, and my principal research area is actually early medieval England. And so the reception of classical literature, Old English language and literature, dipping a little bit into the Middle English period. One of the responsibilities that I have, which is also one of my great joys, teaching here at Wheaton, is to teach the Homer through Shakespeare survey that the department requires of all its students, English 215, Classical and Early British Literature. We begin that class with Homer, excerpts from the Iliad and then the Odyssey. And so while I am principally a specialist in some things that happen later, I also have the privilege of introducing a new group of students to the Odyssey at least once a year, twice in a good year.
I am not a person who teaches the Odyssey regularly. My expertise is in American literature. And so I'm part of this podcast in part because I work to coordinate Core Book every year and organize the events. And I also lead the Aequitas Fellows program in Public Humanities and Arts. And our fellows regularly contribute to designing events and materials for Core Book. And so we're deeply invested in the program. We also have another member of this podcast team, Dr. Alex Loney, Associate Professor of Classics here at the college, and the author of The Ethics of Revenge and the Meanings of the Odyssey, out from Oxford University Press. He is our nerd king, and he will be joining us for most episodes of this podcast. And so now, without further ado, let's move into the first episode. The question, I think, that sets us up at first, when we first consider reading this book, is how would you even start? Where is the beginning of this book? What do I do? What do I need to get started? As a person who has read the Odyssey several times but has never studied it, I start to grasp after materials, articles, Google searches, etc. What do I do and what do I need?
So I think that there are many things that one could reasonably want in order to set out on reading the Odyssey, but actually relatively few things that one truly needs. So there are loads of questions that hover around the epic. Who wrote it? Was it a single person or not? This goes by the name of the Homeric question in the scholarship. There are questions about meter, about oral performance and the oral formulaic hypothesis, all of these wonderful, really, really, really interesting things. But probably the best way to get started is simply to begin and then decide to what extent those kinds of big traditional questions are questions that you personally want to explore.
Well, that's super comforting to me as a reader of especially 20th and 21st century literature with my students. We always talk about the way that the beginning of a work is a zone of pressurized meaning, right? It's a place that tells us about the important things that are coming and also might give us a kind of guide to how to proceed. And so it comforts me to think that across these millennia, there's a kind of possibility of doing a similar thing. Okay, so shall we read some?
Let's read.
Okay, all right. So now I am reading from Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. And what translation are you reading from, Weber?
Right now I have Robert Fagel's in front of me, which is the one I usually teach from, so it has all my notes.
Excellent. And throughout this podcast, we'll be relying on a number of different translations of the text believing that we just really experience the text in fullness by engaging with it in its original language, which Dr. Looney will help us do, but also in as many translations from as many times as possible. How far do I go?
Fagles helpfully puts a paragraph break at the end of what for him is line 12. So usually roughly around line 11 or line 12 is where you'll find the end of this section called the Proem, which is just the traditional term for the sort of introduction to an epic poem. So in Fagles, it ends with this, after an em dash, it says, "Sing for our time too." Wilson has a slightly different rendering, but that's where you want to stop.
Okay, great. And this term, proem, that's a thing?
That's a thing.
Okay, can you tell me about proems?
Sure. So, at least in my experience, we mostly talk about proems with what we might loosely call epic poetry, so long narrative poetry, usually from traditional cultures. And the proems are interesting. I mean, you used the phrase earlier, zone of pressurized meaning. That's a helpful description. The proem usually sets the tone for the poem, will introduce you to its major characters or concerns, and very often functions as a sort of a self-contained section that is somehow apart from the main narrative, and so you can kind of tell where it stops, because you'll notice that the poem suddenly shifts gears in order to get into some more detail or to launch out on the story or whatever it is.
You know, I have more questions about that because I felt like there were a number of, beginnings in this. It begins and it begins again and begins again. So we'll talk more about that.
Sounds good.
Let's start with Wilson and then Fagles. Tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered on the sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. He failed, and for their own mistakes they died. They ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. Now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times. Find the beginning.
And then Fagles. Right?
Okay, Fagles.
Fagles. Sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course, once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities of men he saw, and learned their minds. Many pains he suffered heartsick on the open sea, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home. But he could not save them from disaster, hard as he strove. The recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all. The blind fools, they devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god wiped from sight the day of their return. Launch out on his story, Muse, daughter of Zeus. Start from where you will. Sing for our time too.
Okay, here we go. This is an amazing beginning in so many ways. I have so many thoughts and questions. And of course, the first thought I have is what a breathtaking beginning. All right.
Yeah.
Tell me about a complicated man. To use that term, complicated, to describe a person, or how Fagles talks about it, the man of twists and turns. I want to know more about what that means. Is that twists and turns of fate? Yeah, but I don't know. What does that mean? I guess that's a question. What are the options here for what that particularly means?
Great question. And I think we have a few options. The first thing that is worth saying that anyone will tell you is that what Fagles renders as this phrase, the man of twists and turns, Wilson renders a little more compactly as just a complicated man. That is an epithet, which is sort of a traditional term you use in Homeric and other epic poetry, where each character, divine or human, will get assigned usually a small set of different epithets that'll regularly be used of them. So this one in Greek it's Polytropon where it appears here, Polytropos in the nominative for the three of you who are interested in something. and so Poly is where we get the poly prefix in modern English, which means many. The tropos or tropon part is a turn. So just like we talk about literary tropes or tropological meanings of things, right, all come from the same word. So a many turning or a many turned man, and I guess that's the problem. Is he many turning or many turned? Oh. And if he's many turned, what is he turned by? Himself? Other people? The will of Zeus? I think all of these are options, right? Any of those, all these possibilities are in play. The epithet's a traditional one. It gets used of Odysseus in the Iliad as well. And one of the things that becomes apparent about Odysseus in the Iliad is that he's a great military strategist, or well, maybe a great military tactician is a better description. And so he's got a twisty and turny mind. He's able to think ahead of other people to plan what they will do, or when what he ought to do, how they're likely to respond, and then how he ought to sort of cut off that option. He's also twisting and turning, I think, because in this poem, he's just pushed around geographically. He gets pushed around the map a lot, all over the place. There are also, and I'm sure we'll get to this in future episodes, some kind of surprising reversals in his decisions. That he twists and turns in that sense. You never quite know what he's going to do. I think there are other ways in which we can say that he twists or turns metaphorically, that maybe you'll come up later. But he's also somebody who suffers a great deal, and you hear that, right? Many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea. There are times when it feels like Odysseus is sort of being pushed around the world by the Olympian gods, and so he's a man of twists and turns in that sense too.
So a complicated, fully rounded person, right? I mean, I'm just struck by the sense of his behavior as being overdetermined or having multiple causes, right? The verbs in the Wilson really stand out to me on that. He failed to bring his men back home. That's his responsibility. But for their own mistakes, his men died. So I guess it was their fault. So he's responsible, but not for that tragedy that seems to be weirdly specific in the middle of the poem, right? Like it refers to this one incident later in the book when there are lots of incidents as a specific example of complication, I guess, or multiple causes for a thing. So I'm thinking that feels very modern to me in a way, right? To be complicated or to be like a rich, fully rounded character or something like that. I feel like I want to get to know him. Like I can't put him in a box.
Yeah, I think those are fair reactions, and I guess as somebody who spends most of his time with pre-modern literature, I mean, it does feel very modern because very often we've been told that we ought to expect round characters from modern literature and flat characters from pre-modern literature.
Paintings.
I would respectfully disagree with that view of things, but I mean, I think complicated really is a brilliant rendering of that epithet. If I can wax etymological again for a minute, so. It comes from the Latin plicare, which is to fold, right? So something that is complicated is folded back several times upon itself. And so you're right, that when you're confronted with a complex character, you are invited to unfold each of those folds and sort of see what you can see. I really appreciated, too, your use of the word overdetermined to talk about just the events in the epic, because this is a problem that we face in both of the Homeric epics. So the Iliad, too, has this line in its Proem that says, "The will of Zeus was moving towards its end," kind of giving the impression that Zeus is in control of everything. But, of course, the whole epic is about what humans choose to do. And so that problem of sometimes called double causality, is it the gods or is it humans? And if humans, which ones? That's a problem to which these poems are very alive and I think a really important starting point for our reading.
Well, if it's talking about suffering too, the question why comes up so much, when we're thinking, why does this happen? Why does this happen? Did I do something wrong?
Right. Yeah. And not unlike the Book of Job could also be said to be sort of
and I'm just
complicated.
I'm feeling the connection, I guess, across time when I think about trying to find the origin of suffering, if that's even useful, right, to do. But and this poem doesn't even, well, it seems like it's not even deciding, right? It's leaving them both right there.
Yeah.
Can't just say it.
Yes, well, I think, I mean, maybe your earlier observation that this poem seems to have many beginnings, I think we can find certain origins for suffering, but we may never find the origin of suffering in this poem. Mm-hmm. More on that later, I think when we get to book 19. But...
So, well, then let me ask another question. So I noticed that when you were reading the first line of the Odyssey and Fagles, it says, "Sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns." Mm-hmm. But in Wilson, it says, "Tell me about a complicated man, period, line break. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost." So, how does that work to translate these poems and to move the muse word onto a different line? What's happening there? Why is it in the first line in one and in the second line in another?
Good question, and without having sort of interviewed either Emily Wilson or Robert Fagles, I probably can't get a definitive answer, but I can certainly explain what I think those different choices, both of which I think are legitimate, are creating. So, in the Greek text, the muse, or the word is goddess, Thea, No, I'm sorry. That's the Iliad. It's Musa in the Odyssey. It's the Muse. She's right there in the middle of the first line where Fagles puts her.
Okay.
So Wilson moves her to the second line, but by doing so gets to put her at the beginning of the line, which puts her in a more emphatic position, which I think is useful. What both translators, I think, capture really well and accurately is that the very first word of the epic is man, so andra. And he's a man in an oblique case. He's a man in the accusative. Again, for those of you who are interested in such things, he's not the grammatical subject of the sentence.
Oh.
The muse is the grammatic. Tell me about him. But that man is indeed the first word of the poem. And so I think Fagles gets at that by repeating the word. So you get man twice in the first line of Fagles' translation. I think Wilson deals with that by putting man as the very last word and introducing it with that amazing word, complicated.
Right. I mean, it's a matchless first line. It's
very well done. Yes.
So wonderful. Okay, so I was not classically educated, so I only read little excerpts of this book in, say, like 10th grade or something like that. A lot of the stories that are present in this book are ones that are only sort of familiar to me. So can you tell me, like, about what that is referred to in the third line, when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy? What's Troy? What happened there? It's clearly like something I would Google if I were trying to figure that out. So can you give us a little background there?
Well, as it turns out, there is much to say about the fabled city of Troy.
From time to time in the podcast, we invite Wheaton College students in to give a kind of key background information and summary for those who are catching up on the reading. And we're calling them Sassy Student Summaries, and I think you'll see why. And now here is our first Sassy Student Summary about the Trojan War.
So, the background to the Odyssey is the Trojan War. But the Trojan War starts not with the Trojans, but with 3 goddesses. Up on Olympus, Zeus invited all the gods to the biggest rager this side of the Hellespont. All is in order until Eris, the goddess of chaos, crashes the party without an invitation. She throws a golden apple into the courtyard addressed "For the Fairest," and that title is claimed instantly. 3 separate times. Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite all think it's for them, and Zeus definitely doesn't want to get caught in the middle of that catfight. So they find an impartial judge, Paris, one of the 50 princes in a little city called Troy. The 3 goddesses all offer him invaluable gifts to win his choice, but he just can't resist being basic and says the goddess of love is the prettiest. Aphrodite's promised gift to Paris was marriage to the hottest woman on earth. Unfortunately, her husband wasn't too happy about that. So when Paris runs off with his new bride, Helen, Menelaus gathers all of his besties with the help of his brother Agamemnon to get her back. They roll up to Troy, but Paris isn't giving up easily. All attempts at peace fail, mostly because the gods have whipped up some popcorn and are enjoying the show too much to let it end. Menelaus' Greek army and the Trojans are evenly matched, so the war lasts for ages. 10 whole years go by full of fighting, infighting, and river fighting. Must be a tale for another epic. Finally, our man Odysseus hatches a brilliant plan. A horse, of course. The Greek army pretends to bail on this whole rescue Helen thing and leave the Trojans a not at all suspicious gift filled to the brim with soldiers. Once the Trojans bring the horse inside, Odysseus and his homies pop out and open the gate for the rest of the Greeks. They destroy everything and grab Helen. With the mission finally complete, all that's left for Odysseus and the Greeks is an easy-peasy cruise back across the Mediterranean. Surely nothing could go wrong, right?
The point is that this is a story about a man who's coming home from a war.
Okay, so is this a real war? Is this fiction? Is this a true story?
Yes. Hard to know is the answer to that question. Probably there is some historical event that happened at some point long ago that kind of roughly corresponds to the Trojan War, but it's a really, really challenging thing to explore from a scholarly perspective. And certainly, even if there was a real event that sort of loosely corresponded to it, the Trojan War is one of the sort of preeminent stories in the Western literary tradition. That is, it has its own life as a fiction or a literary conceit, whatever relationship it may have to history.
So does that mean we don't even know, like, the location of Troy? Or as a city? Like, I mean, not to be all geographically unknowing, but I really am.
So I think we have a pretty good guess at the location of Troy, which is near the Bosporus in the sort of northwestern part of modern day Turkey.
Okay.
Which, if you think about it, is pretty far from Greece. And so that is, I mean, not, maybe with an airplane you can get there pretty quickly, but if you're imagining the sorts of ships to which the Mycenaean Greeks had access in like the middle of maybe the 12th century BC, that's a long trip.
Okay.
So one of the things that is really interesting about, Odysseus from Ithaca going to participate in the Trojan War, it's kind of an international story. That its imaginary world is pretty large. But then, where are the Symplegades? Where is Scylla? Where is Charybdis? Where are the caves of the Cyclopes? People have ideas, but those things are a little more difficult to determine.
Is that why I don't see any dotted lines on the maps? Because whenever I encounter a book like this in an imaginary world or a real world, right, I'm sort of looking for the dotted line that says, okay, the character goes from here to here to here to here to here, like Paul's fourth missionary journey.
That's exactly what I was thinking of.
Well, right, and so I look for those, and I don't think in Fagles, and I don't think in Wilson,
with a map.
there is a map right there.
You're right.
But there's just all these dotted cities, and I presume they're referred to in the text itself. But there's no dotted lines, and I really want a dotted line. I've got to be honest. How would you explain that move, not to make a call on that for a translator or for a set of scholars making a scholarly edition?
Well, the poem isn't necessarily interested in giving us a traceable real-world geography, and so we don't really have any rigorous way of reconstructing it. I think I would love to hear Dr. Loney's reaction to this question too, as he is much more in this area than I am. But the notion that the landscape of the Odyssey is as much imaginary as it is, or psychological as it is real, is something that a lot of readers have felt in the poem, and I think helps to explain its popularity. And so, we miss a dotted line, but what we get in return is worth it.
We could be anywhere in our own heads. We're free to make up the details. Is that what you mean,
or that by not sort of clinging too closely to real geography, however he or they or whoever Homer is would have understood it, Homer opens up the possibility for an itinerary that is kind of more deeply meaningful, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. In other words, that if you were to try to write a poem about a journey from, I don't know, New York City to Florida or something, which was deeply significant because it sort of mirrored some inward journey that you were going on, it might be to your advantage not to worry about all of the roads along the way. Right, that the sort of schematic of the thing can work better if you hold more loosely to those details.
Well, and that kind of flexibility is, I think, referred to a little bit in Fagel's translation, "Start from where you will." But I mean, in terms of it being more meaningful, I certainly find the end of the poem here, "Sing for our time too," or "Tell the old story for our modern times," incredibly engaging. Right, a kind of welcome. For me to think about it, for me to feel a connection to this text. But of course, it wasn't really written with me in mind. So can you talk to me a little bit about what Sing for Our Time Too or Tell the Old Story for Our Modern Times has to say to its own time? I mean, it's such a breathtaking statement. Yeah,
and I'm intrigued by those translations insofar as, and I was looking back at the Proem in Greek before we started, and what it appears to me to say is what it says and what that appears to me to mean is epikaichemin, tell it for us, or tell it to us, which certainly could mean, right, like tell the old story for our modern times. could also just mean, tell us. But Fagles and Wilson are both very good translators who are sort of deep in the scholarship as well. And when they agree on that interpretation, it makes me think that there's probably something that they've got that I'm missing. And so I think this is another Dr. Loney question.
Right.
So there's maybe some sort of flexibility in how to interpret, those three words. But I think they're important, at least in part, because the Odyssey, it's funny because the what we call the Homeric poems, right, stand kind of at the beginning of the Western literary tradition. We don't really have anything that survived to us that we know is older. But they were already really, really old stories by the time they sort of coalesced in whatever, in the fashion, more or less, in which they came down to us. That if we imagine, and there's a lot of supposition here, and we can talk more about it if it's useful, if we imagine that these poems come to be in more or less the form in which we have them, sometime roughly around 800 BC, which is usually, these are sort of the kind of starting point dates I give to my students, and folks who are interested in the details can go much deeper for sure. They're telling stories about this event that is half history and half legend or myth, as you pointed out, that if we had to take a stab at dating it, maybe the middle of the 11th century, maybe the middle of the 12th century BC, although some would push it back further or locate it differently. That's a lot of time. And so for whoever it is who's reciting this poem, the rhapsode reciting this poem, to say, sing it for our time too. Well, it's a really old story. I mean, it's not unlike somebody getting up, on the street in Chicago right now, telling a story from the middle of the 17th century and saying, sing it for our time too. Right? Like, that's the span of years we're talking about. Like Hamilton? Perhaps.
Or, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. Well, right, exactly. It's a story whose antiquity is already recognized by its audience.
And
right.
It's sort of legendness having to do with power, etc. We needn't push that too far, I guess, that comparison, but everything is compared.
I mean, he's been compared to Shakespeare so many times already. Why not throw Homer into the mix?
Well, I mean, that actually brings up a thing that seems remarkable to me. When I teach reading poems, I often ask students to think about the speaker of the poem. And so I'm interested that there's a sort of lyric eye, in a way, right? Sing to me, muse, so that there's a poet doing this talking. The speaker is a poet who's telling a story. That seems moving or interesting to me because it makes the poem about storytelling as much as about the story. Which is to say, I was just thinking about that section, and I don't think it's really a spoiler, in Book 9, where they sort of talk about, where Odysseus talks about how good it is to tell stories around the table. Yeah. And that's another moment where I think the poem is asserting the value of storytelling in a community, of shared suffering, of what it can be to eat together and tell stories. And so I don't know if you have thoughts about the poet as an important presence in the poem.
Yeah, absolutely. Several. And I perhaps will try to restrict myself to one or two for the moment. So I do think that the sort of distance or whatever that exists between the poet and the muse is interesting. So you have a poet who is telling the story, and you're right that it's a story about a man who is complicated in part because he is an inveterate teller of stories himself. But the poet is also asking the muse not just to inspire him, but to tell him the story. And that last line, right, sing for our time too, or tell it also to us, this seems to be another thing which is a little bit overdetermined. Is it the poet or is it the muse who is telling the story? And in some sense, it is both.
Well, if you don't know the history, right, if it's already an ancient story, all those details you have to sort of flesh out when you don't know. You've got the basic outline of the historical story and you have to make it live or whatever.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. And so I guess one of the questions that I have coming away from the poem then is are we imagining a situation where the poet is sort of an intermediary between, us, the general public, and the muse? Which is to say, all of the inspiration and understanding of the muse passes through the poet to us. Or are we kind of experiencing the muse's gift together with the poet, even as the poet also is helping to shape the story that we're experiencing? Right? So
the poet is complicated too.
Maybe.
Well, I like it. I mean, again,
Well, we like complexity, I think.
Alas, but it's so true.
But then if you think about the investment, as you said, that the poem has in storytelling, and even that in Book 8, right, shortly before this section, you're talking about that blind rhapsode Demonicus shows up and, tells all these stories. And he's often understood as this sort of if we think of Homer as an historical person, a Homer-like figure, that, yeah, this poem seems to have an awful lot invested in the representation of storytelling, and even in stories that get told multiple times differently, as we will see with Odysseus's accounts of his own journey as we go forward.
Well, one of the great pleasures of reading the Odyssey and having core book as the Odyssey this year is the way that the retellings of and reception of the Odyssey is something we revel in, right? Let's do all the films and the dances and the music and all of it, and it inspires us to commission new poetry, new artworks, all of that. So I feel that an appropriate behavior given how central the telling is.
I think that's absolutely right. It's a story that's sort of endlessly retellable.
So maybe the sort of last thing that I want to talk about this first episode or ask about is that line, find the beginning or start from where you will, feels to me like an almost joke given how many beginnings there might be.
Yeah.
So if you start, and of course I'll say more about this in a minute about how many books we'll do for each episode and so on, but just flipping over the pages into the first scene, we've got this kind of retelling of where Odysseus is in Calypso's cave right there. But then, instead of going further on his story, like he's trapped in the cave, and then we just leave him there and go to Olympus to talk with the gods about their opinions about what he should do and what's going on there. And then we don't go back to Odysseus either. Right after that, we go to Athena going to see Telemachus. And so I was ready to be told about the man, but
It's going to be a while before we get there.
Can you talk about this? What is this?
I can certainly talk about it. Whether or not I have a satisfying answer is a whole different question.
This is what nerdery is,
right?
Robert.
Exactly.
Yes.
So, yes, is it a joke of some sort? I mean, as you were saying that, one thing that comes to my mind is you're right, that looking here at Fagel's translation, what we hear is, in the next few lines, is this: by now, all the survivors, all who avoided headlong death, were safe at home, escaped the wars and waves, but one man alone, his heart set on his wife and his return, Calypso, the bewitching nymph, the lustrous goddess, held him back. And so on. And so Odysseus is stuck with Calypso. Calypso's name is related to the Greek word for to hide or conceal, hidden. Like the apocalypse is the apocalypse. The apocalypse is the revelation, because what is hidden gets
Revealed,
uncovered.
yeah.
Right. So apocalypso, yeah. So no apo here, just a Calypso. So she's concealment. In other words, our beginning is hiding.
Oh, yes,
Or,
yes.
Odysseus is hidden. Maybe other things are hidden as well. And so maybe there is a sort of an elaborate etymological game here unfolding over these first 4 books, because it's going to be quite a while before we get back to him, and before we see exactly what's being concealed on Calypso's island.
Well, it feels to me too that then if he is hidden for a while, it might be to reveal something else, right? Like more about those main ideas about multiple determination. So when they sort of talk about the mortals blaming the gods, they say we cause their suffering, but they themselves increase it by their folly, right? So they take up that question that was in the Proem already on the very next page. So that's brought up, but also some other kind of thematic ideas, right? Further in that section, they sort of tell the story of an unfaithful, murderous wife, right? And that, of course, raises the question again and again. Coming home, Odysseus is coming home. He's longing for his wife and family, palace, and so forth. And the question of fidelity or reuniting in relationship across difficulty or whatever is raised.
Yes.
In this concealing time.
Yeah.
So it's almost like, hang on, you need a little more before we get into this.
No, I think that's right. I mean, you talk about this being a sort of time for the poem to introduce some of its central concerns. I mean, homecoming, above all, is the sort of theme that appears here. And in this story about Agamemnon and Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, which is the story that will inspire Aeschylus's Oresteia, some centuries down the road from the standpoint of literary history, the specter of that story, right, the homecoming that goes wrong, kind of haunts Odysseus and us, right, for quite a long time. And that's one of those stories that gets retold, I think, 4 times in the first several books
So
of
it
the
is a
poem.
preview too.
Yeah.
So this is a zone of pressurized meaning too. I mean, maybe
I think so.
Maybe the entire thing is. I mean, we're in the middle of this nerd journey, and you can study as hard as you want over any passage in this.
And indeed, folks have done in Homer. And there's, some people will tell you that, well, that's just what poetry is, right? Poetry is meaningful language condensed as much as it can be condensed. But even so, I mean, I think one finds ebbs and flows, and especially if you think a little bit about an oral performance where somebody's reciting this poem to a group of listeners for a long time. I mean, you've just got to have some sort of, for the sake of your listener and their attention, you've got to have some sort of rhythm or movement in the story to help move them through it. I think you're right that this section especially is very rich, but it does ultimately move into a narrative that's sort of a little bit maybe less dense from the standpoint of the sorts of things we're talking about.
Okay, so here we are, heading toward the end of our very first episode, and we've looked at the proem, and maybe a little bit more of those zones of pressurized meaning at the beginning. As I go into this, kind of seeking to sum up where I am positioned to read the rest of the epic, I think to myself about the sort of complication of a person and the reasons that they do the things they do, or the ways that they do the things they do. So both strategy and fate and causation. So I'm thinking about that as a pretty central thematic concern, along with the role of the gods. And I feel like I need to talk more about the gods. Maybe next week.
Indubitably.
So I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about the time difference between me as a reader right now and the sort of audience of the epic earlier, right? The idea that it was an old story, that feels really interesting to me, and I wonder how that's going to come up in the details of the poem. I think about just how many different stories or the nature of storytelling that is going on here, and it makes me want to pay attention to how the story goes, its structure, its reference to other bits of the text, so more nerdery, I guess, is what I'm thinking. But that kind of shivery feeling that you get when you're about to start something really great is a feeling that I think this proem creates, with its tantalizing bits of stories that I don't know about, with its assertion that this is a complicated man and you're not sure if he's going to deceive you or create sympathy for understanding the difficulty of why things happen to him. It feels like a story I could connect to in this weird modern time.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I would just to pick up on a couple things from what you've said. I would interpret that last line of the poem, or I would receive that last line of the poem, sing it for our time too, or sing it also for us, as a reminder that this is as much our story as it is anybody else's, that even the original audience of the poem, whoever they were, however they were conceived, felt some kind of distance between themselves in these stories, and so we don't need to be bothered by the fact that there's a distance too. I have always received that line as an invitation. I would hope that other people would see it that way as well. This is your poem as much as it is anyone's. And in terms of some of the other things you were saying there, I do have a favorite quotation here from Eva Braun's Homeric Moments, which I always offer to my students as a way to say, okay, well, if you're going to attend to one thing, attend to this. And I thought I would share it briefly. Braun is riffing here on this legend that Homer himself was blind, and because he was blind, could sort of see more deeply into other things. And so Demodocus, the poet in Book 8, is also blind, and so tradition has it. And then you think about Milton, then when I consider how my light is spent, and it's beautiful connections emerge. So, riffing on that, Braun writes this. I think that Homer's alleged blindness betokens the extraordinary visual acuity of his poetry, the sharply detailed inner visions he constructs for us in words. Such sights of the imagination tend toward a kind of vivid momentariness, a pregnant momentousness. Much later, Aristotle will bring into use a word very familiar to us in its modern adaptations. Energeia, often translated activity. For us, energy is the capacity for being actively at work. But energeia is the fulfillment itself of that capacity, expressed not in locomotion but as a kind of vibrant stasis, when any being is fully at work just being itself, being what it was meant to be. And so the notion that I think the Odyssey is a poem that helps us to see things fully at work being themselves is among the best reasons to read it. And I think if you read it with that spirit or from that perspective, you will not feel that you have wasted your time.
Well, I'm in. Let's go. In our next episode, we are going to talk about books 1 through 4. Our listeners can feel free to listen to this episode, any episode, before, during, or after their reading. And they can rely on our Sassy students for summary and help through a reminder of the main action of those stories. And we'll see you next time.
Looking forward to it.
This is the time in our show where we share with you some of what we're hearing about how the Odyssey is showing up in culture. Homer's epics have prompted the making of ekphrastic art of all kinds even before they were written down. So it's nothing new, but some of these cultural happenings might be new to you, so we thought we'd share. It's not like we could be comprehensive even if we wanted to, but we thought it might be fun. Now, we aren't really recommending the things that we mentioned here because what we are recommending is that you read the Odyssey with us. We are pretty much spending all our recommendation capital on recommending that one book. Plus, we don't really know what you like or what you need, what bothers you, or what you can't really take right now. There's a part in the Odyssey where Penelope just can't listen to the story of her husband at Troy when Phemius starts to tell it. We don't want to hurt you either. Besides, the Odyssey isn't rated G or even PG-13, and who knows what the ratings would be on these bits. So instead of thinking of them as recommendations, consider this segment more as gossipy cultural hearsay. Hey, did you hear about that show, that concept album, that novel? And we'd love for you to share with us your own news of Odyssey-adjacent culture at an email to core.studies@wheaton.edu. Here we go. Hey, have you heard about Epic the Musical by Jorge Rivera Herons? It's a total social media sensation. A bunch of concept albums retelling the Odyssey. The musical hasn't been staged yet, but 7 out of the 9 concept albums, sagas, have been released on most major social media platforms. Fans binge these songs hard. If you'd like to hear more, find a link in our show notes. Thank you so much for listening. Do you have questions about the Odyssey that you'd like our Core Book podcast team to consider? Send your questions to core.studies@wheaton.edu by December 1st, and we'll consider them for our question and response episode, the last of our season. We might not be able to get to them all, but we'd love to hear from you. We'll be back next week with more nerd love. But if you miss us before then, visit www.wheaton.edu/corebook, or better yet, find someone to share the Odyssey with. With Core Book, as with all books, we read better together. The Core Book podcast is a production of the Core Book program at Wheaton College in partnership with the Aequitas Fellows Program in Public Humanities and Arts. Aequitas PHA is a creative studio and scholarship program that brings together 4-year cohorts of undergraduate student artists, theater makers, dancers, musicians, writers, and all manner of scholarly nerds to build publicly engaged projects in the humanities and arts. You can find out more about the program and all the Aequitas themes, including global public health, sustainability, politics, philosophy, and economics, and urban leadership at www.wheaton.edu/Aequitas. That's AEQUITAS. You can find out more about Core Book and look at our years of archives and reading materials for all our core books, from Shushaku Endo's Silence to Marilyn Robinson's Gilead and Daniel Nayeri's Everything Sad is Untrue at www.wheaton.edu/corebook. Our podcast is produced by the endlessly capable Emma Smith. Music is by Tristan Guzman. Art is by Lily Groves and Cecilia Waidatt, with audio editing by Emma Smith. Our Sassy student summarizers are Zoe Foster-Whiddon, Houston Heinrich, and Emma Smith. Special thanks to the Wheaton College Aequitas Fellows Program in Public Humanities and Arts, Bailey Garrison, Mariah Sray, Anna Porter Puckett, Karina Adamowitz, Linda Bretz, Sray Austriaco, Rebecca Larson, Les Barker, and the Wheaton College Marketing and Communications Department.